So today we're going to talk about a topic that I've talked about it before on this channel, whether in dedicated videos or just kind of as a side note. But it's something that I feel like we kind of need to do a bit of an update on, because if you are a Nintendo Switch or a Nintendo Switch 2 owner who is subscribed to the online service, this is something that you probably signed up to the online service in order to access. It was one of the selling points of having to pay for Nintendo Online stuff, and I think it was a really cool idea, but the execution and mostly the rollout of it has left a bit to be desired. And I, of course, am talking about the Nintendo Classics, the old games for old people such as myself. Now, Nintendo Classics originally started out with very humble beginnings, just taking a look at NES and SNES, and of course, over time has definitely grown into its own thing. You have stuff from the NES, the Super Nintendo, the Game Boy Color, the Game Boy Advance, the N64, the Sega Genesis, and now if you're a Nintendo Switch 2 owner, you have access to GameCube games as well. And I think for the most part, it's been pretty good experiences. Now, obviously, some of the N64 games did have a little bit of trouble. You might remember the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time situation where, well, there were some graphical glitches that were in the Switch version of the game, but Nintendo has fixed these things. Being able to play these games online with friends is a nice little feature as well, and overall, I do like the service. But I still have questions kind of about what's going on with the service, because the rollout of games has definitely been questionable, to say the least. There is no rhyme or reason as to when you get games on certain systems. The announcements are usually a couple of days or maybe the day of the release of the game, and it seems like there's no sort of buildup or anticipation for this stuff. It just kind of happens out of the blue, and then, hey, this game is coming to this system. And I'm someone who is a bit older, and I remember the virtual console aspect of things on the Nintendo Wii. Now, the virtual console was definitely a bit different than what we have now with Nintendo Classics because, well, you bought these games, and you owned those games, and you could play them whenever you want. But when you look at what the virtual console did, it was always a weekly update as far as when new games were going to come to the virtual console. I thought that was a really fun and exciting thing. There was always that aura of mystery as far as what games are going to be revealed for the virtual console this upcoming week. I believe it was like Wednesday at noon when the games would drop on the East Coast, but I could be wrong on the date and the time of that. But when you look at what the virtual console had going for it, there was a lot more systems that were involved in this. Now, of course, you didn't have things like GameCube or whatnot, but you did have things like the TurboGrafx 16, the Sega Game Gear, and you even had some arcade games on there as well. Neo Geo was also represented. It was definitely an eclectic mix, and with all of these different systems, you were able to offer a bunch of different games for a bunch of different platforms every week. You know, there was always something new to look forward to, and yes, you would have to purchase the game. They weren't just given to you on an online service that you are indeed paying for, at least monthly, potentially yearly, but it was kind of a fun thing, and I think we got a really good variety of stuff. Now, with the Nintendo Classics, it's obviously very, very different, but my main issue with Nintendo Classics is they just seem to forget about certain systems at certain times. When you actually look at the rollout of games, it always seems like when a new system is added, it's very front-loaded. You know, you're getting anywhere from a handful to 10 or 12 games sometimes. Then you get a little trickle for a couple of months, and then the trickle just comes to a complete stop. You just stop getting games for this system, and what used to be, you know, potentially a monthly or every other month thing ends up becoming like an every 6-month thing. And I kind of question what's going on with the curation of these games, because when you look at some of these titles, they're not exactly heavy hitter titles. They're not exactly games that I think people are fawning to play on things like the Super Nintendo or the Game Boy. They're kind of throwaway titles, more niche titles, almost like it just happens to be whatever game we could get onto the service, instead of third-party companies wanting to work with Nintendo to bring their games to this service. And that's something we'll talk about in just a minute. But first off, I want to take a look at the lineup of games for each individual system. We're not going to go over it like one by one or anything like that. I'm more so interested in the releases of these games and like when they came out, and then the trickle effect of where things just kind of come to an end. You could see here when this was originally released in September 19th of 2018 for the Switch 1, you had a wealth of games for NES stuff. And as time went on, October, November, December, January, February, March, it's pretty much became a monthly thing. And then as time goes on, you see the length of time becomes very spread out. Now we're going to a couple of times in 2023. We had what? There was 3 releases in 2023, and we actually haven't gotten any new NES games in 2024. And when you think about third-party games, yes, they are available on various compilations and stuff like that, but there are a lot of third-party games, you know, classic Final Fantasy, classic Dragon Warrior games, Turtles, Castlevania, a lot of Konami games and stuff like that that are not represented in this service. But hey, we've got Mahjong, I don't really know how to say that, but like it's very strange. It seems like since 2023, really since 2022, it's just like, oh, okay, well, we're done with the NES. You go down to the Super Nintendo. Once again, very front-loaded. Tons of stuff here, including a game, Super Soccer, which was removed, which was a very questionable thing. And then you go along here and pretty decent output every other month, it seems like, and then well, we start to get bigger gaps. And to be fair, like January or 2025 has been pretty decent with the amount of titles, but how many of these games are you really interested in? Once again, the Super Nintendo was known for classic RPGs. There are tons of great RPGs that are available on the system that are not available on the Nintendo Switch Online, and it's kind of like, well, why? What's the hesitation? You would think that companies would want to put games on here, especially deeper cut games that, you know, you can't buy on a platform right now. Like, you can't buy Secret of Evermore or Chrono Trigger on a Nintendo platform or PlayStation or Xbox. Why wouldn't they be added into this service? Then, of course, you have other systems. We have Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Once again, good output, good output. You know, it's been kind of decent for this system, but you also have to remember, this one came out in 2023, so it's still relatively fresh for Nintendo to add games to this. Nintendo 64 started off with a bang. It was pretty much every month we got a new game added to it, and then the gaps got bigger and bigger. And I mean, we've gotten 2 solid titles this year, but how do we go from every month to like every 6 months with this, especially when there are critical games that you could still add to the service? I mean, Turok 2 Seeds of Evil got a remake, Shadow Man got a remake. Yep, you can play the vanilla versions on the Switch Online portion of your subscription service. We still don't have Donkey Kong 64, which, I mean, is inherently a bad game, or Diddy Kong Racing, which is an excellent game. And it's like, well, why aren't these on there? I think Donkey Kong 64 should have came out to coincide with the Donkey Kong Bonanza release, but for whatever reason, it's not on there. And you could be saying, well, it's an Xbox game. Well, I mean, Killer Instinct Gold is an Xbox game. Perfect Dark is an Xbox game, and those are on here. Xbox has also licensed rare games from the NES onto the service as well, such as Solar Jetman and RC Pro-Am, so I don't think that's a really solid conversation piece to have. Sega Genesis, once again, very front-loaded as far as the titles are concerned. Oh, look, Konami games such as Castlevania Bloodlines. So we could have the Konami game of Castlevania Bloodlines on the Sega Genesis, but we can't have the NES classics on there, such as Castlevania 1 through 3. We have Super Castlevania 4 on the Super Nintendo, yet there's no Castlevania 1 through 3. And when you look at the list of games, obviously very front-loaded, as we've always seen. And as time has gone on, it's pretty much come down to a trickle. We had 2 entries, or we had 1 entry. Look at this gap. June 27, 2023 to November 28, 2024. Well over a year before we had more Genesis games added to the service. And let's be realistic. There are a ton of Sega Genesis games that can be added on here that should be added on here. But for whatever reason, they're not on here. Game Boy Advance, of course, a newer system, 2023 with a decent start, and then, of course, as time has gone on, it's gotten quieter, and GameCube is the latest entry that we have into Nintendo Switch Online's Nintendo Classics portion, so it makes sense that this is kind of the focal point with games releasing pretty much every month. But I go back to my main question here of what's up with certain titles that are very big, that are very impactful, that were very essential to these systems not being available on Nintendo Switch Online. And I almost wonder if it's like a money issue. Like, I wonder if Nintendo has gone to, Squeenix and been like, hey, it'd be dope to have Final Fantasy 4 through 6, Chrono Trigger, Secret of Evermore, what's that other game that I really like that was an Enix game where you're like a little specimen and then you grow up. It's like an evolutionary game. I can't think of the name of it. But like, you have to imagine Nintendo's gone to Square Enix and been like, hey, we want these games. And then they've been like, okay, give us this money. And Nintendo's probably like, why? And they're like, well, we could resell these games and potentially make more money on other platforms than what you're offering us here if we do a collection. Like, look at the Final Fantasy Classic Collection that came out physically. So is it really worthwhile for companies to want to put higher tier games such as, Final Fantasies and Chrono Triggers and stuff like that onto Nintendo Switch Online? It does feel like there is some sort of a disconnect, and I don't know the business practice of how it works. I would assume that Nintendo goes to these companies and says, hey, are there any games you want to put on our service? And that would kind of make sense to have it, work out that way. But when you see large gaps for certain platforms and then, you get 1 or 2 games a year for a certain platform when there are clearly games that could be added that probably should be added to the service that are, better suited for it than some of the random stuff you get, you kind of got to wonder about the curation process. And is there really a curation process, or is it more so just whatever we can get our hands on? I think one of the things that could really rectify this situation, though, is just having more systems. And I get it. You would still run into the same problem about systems being abandoned and stuff like that. But I do feel like if you had stuff like TurboGrafx 16, Game Gear, maybe some arcade stuff in there as well, to kind of slot in as supplemental content for the bigger content that comes out on these platforms, it would be a lot less noticeable. These gaps would be a lot less noticeable. But then I guess you would potentially run into the same sort of issue where you would have these elongated gaps. I kind of wonder, like, what's the end game for this? Like, some of these systems, it seems like, okay, we're done. You might get 1 or 2 games for the Super Nintendo or the NES, but really, for the most part, we're done with these systems. And it's like, well, okay, but are you going to add more stuff to it? Are you going to add more systems to it? I don't know. It's very bizarre to think about. And when you kind of compare it to the Virtual Console and that experience of how you got weekly games that you would purchase and then you could kind of pick and choose what you wanted, as opposed to just having everything kind of dumped on you. And then if these games don't hit with you, well, it doesn't matter. Those are the games that you have to choose from. So like it or lump it. I don't know. I don't know. I do wonder kind of what is the future for this, and how far can we really go with it, because it feels like certain systems, like to me, the NES, the Super NES, and the N64, I almost feel like they're tapped out. At least in their mind, they're tapped out. I don't think they're tapped out. I still think there are tons of games that you can add to the service that would be super fun. There was a bunch of N64 racing games that you could still do that I think are really well done. You, of course, have 2 heavy hitters with Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong. Super Nintendo, you have classic RPGs. NES, you still have a ton of classic games to choose from that are not represented on here, even though newer versions of those games are. But I just find it very strange, and I'm curious to hear what you guys have to say about this. I'm sure there'll be people in the comments that are like, oh, it's great, it's fine, you're just being nitpicky. And it's like, I mean, I don't think I'm being nitpicky. I'm just simply bringing up a discussion point to have a conversation about it. Remember, folks, asking questions about something does not make you a hater of something. It makes you inquisitive. It's good to ask questions. It's good to wonder and theorize about stuff kind of outside of the box, unless you just want a bunch of people who consume, and don't ask questions. It's not going to be me, pal. Let me know in the comments section down below, though. What do you think of Nintendo's handling of Nintendo Classics for the Nintendo Switch and the Nintendo Switch 2. Do you see it, evolving over time? Obviously, GameCube is the big new system on here. Do you see kind of like what we saw on the Switch 1, where it initially was NES and Super NES, and then Genesis was added? Could they add something like a Dreamcast on here to kind of supplement the GameCube games on the Switch 2 to sort of give it, that newer, fresher experience to make people potentially want to upgrade their, service memberships and, of course, upgrade to Nintendo Switch 2 over a Nintendo Switch 1. And as always, guys, thank you for checking out this video. If you are new to the channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button. I would sincerely appreciate it. Be sure to like, comment, and share the video around if you found it informative or enjoyed the questioning of things. And as always, I'll catch you guys on the next video. Later.